All right, guys, we're back with another Seeing Through Gebser. First and foremost, I want to apologize for having this a little bit late. Very busy. Very busy on my end. I apologize. I have many responsibilities, most importantly to my girlfriend and daughter. Now, in this edition of the book, we are on page 374, so we're getting our way through there, boys. And we will be finishing up our discussion on mathematics and physics and preparing us for next week for biology. Should be fun. Now, check this out, guys. I found my snood. That's what they call these things. Pretty cool, huh? I look like a ninja. Or like some cool, badass thing that you may be asking, Justin, why are you wearing a snood? First of all, don't ask me why it's called that. I have no idea. I don't even know why I know that, but I know it is. But you asking, Justin, why are you wearing a snood indoors? I assume since you're in a house there, it has heating, right? I mean, surely your house has heating. It does, but look at, every time I wear it, my aesthetics are crazy. Look at this. Huh? Put the gun down. Put the bunny back in the box. Unfortunately for you ladies, I'm tied down. Okay. So, we're just moving on. Let's see. I already talked about that. Okay. So, let's just continue. To quote Gebser, the data of the new physics as recounted above clearly show that the problem of time is of decisive importance to them. Unlike the situation of classical or pre-classical physics, the full significance inherent in the new estimation and judgment of quote-unquote time shelters tendencies which in all likelihood cannot be employed and evaluated in physics, although the tendencies towards space-time freedom must be apparent to the physicist, even though he may not be able to quote-unquote grasp space-time freedom because of the limitations imposed by the scientific forms of realization, such as measurement, to which he subscribes. And yet a decisive step has been made in recent years precisely in this direction. In an address given in the second series of lectures on the new perception of world, entitled Atomic Physics and the Law of Causality at St. Gallen in February 1952, Werner Heisenberg... Why do they have meth dealers speaking at important physicist conventions? It's very odd. I wonder if he was wearing a snood. Fuck off, I don't want this. Werner Heisenberg described a quote-unquote state of the microworld of elementary particles which distinctly evidences characteristics of what we have called time freedom. In this lecture, based on his treatise, Paradoxes in the Time Concept in Elemental Particle Theory of 1951, Heisenberg observes that, quote, in very minute space-time regions, that is, in those of the order of magnitude of elemental particles, so this is as... I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if this is as small as you're going to get, but when you get to elemental particles, we're, it's probably 1 degree above atom. I'm not an atom. I'm not a scientist, but we're in a very minute, small, technically measurable, but small aspects of the world. In very minute space-time regions, space and time are remarkably obliterated in such a way that with respect to such minute times that we cannot even correctly define the terms earlier or later. So because in the sort of domain or world that the elemental particles exist, paradoxes abound. We're in this irrational stuff, so we're in the irrational. It's very difficult to pin down a before, now, after, or a later, or earlier. And maybe I'll expand on this idea when we get to the psychology section. Of course, in the world of macro phenomena, nothing would be able to change the space-time structure, but we must reckon with the possibility that experiments with the events in extremely minute space-time realms will show that certain processes appear to take place in the reverse temporal sequence than that required by the laws of causality. Now, obviously, when it says that certain processes appear to take place in the reverse temporal sequence, we are fully in 4D irrational stuff here. We're all aware of the 3D way of doing things, these laws, the mechanistic, the causal, the first this, then that. That causes things. We're way out of here in science. And remember, this is going on 70 years ago. So we've known this for a while. It just takes time to sort of understand these things. And it takes time to recognize the common through line, in this case would be time, permeating all academic disciplines and human forms of expression, which this entire rest of the book is trying to outline. This takes into consideration, this takes into consideration for the basic structure of matter, the atomic processes, which for matter may well be its original process, the freedom from space and time, which is proper to origin whenever we, as Heisenberg has done here, are able to bring this quote-unquote state to awareness. But it's not a question of physics demonstrating in quote-unquote material and quote-unquote measurable form of the basic concepts of the new consciousness structure. Such verification may well be impossible, or else can be achieved only after several decades of further research. The real significance is that physics has worked out basic positions which not only potentially point beyond physics, but also unequivocally point to components of the new consciousness, as is evident with respect to the theme of quote-unquote time in physics and its inherent tendency toward time freedom. The achronon. Chronon, obviously chronos, which is chronological. Achronon is without the chronos, which the achronon allows this this sort of obscuring of earlier or later. We don't know which comes first. It is what allows the reverse temporal sequence that we just covered. The discovery of potential inceptions and making visible the processes of the emergence of consciousness, and thus itself a manifestation of the new consciousness mutation, and not a merely philosophical interpretation, could be dismissed as irrelevant only if it were to restrict itself to the admittedly central theme of time. But there are similar tendencies which can be shown for other important results of recent thought in physics, which brings us to our second point, the supersession of dualism. Now, of course, I want you to take a shot in the dark, how we've superseded dualism when Einstein unified space and time. Do you think that's a supersession of dualism? And I guess Gebser's kind of made it clear that it both is and it isn't at the same time. The supersession of dualism is yet another result of the new physics. The way was prepared by Einstein, who fused the oppositional categories of space and time into the unity of the space-time continuum. So that's a very, very obvious example of the supersession of dualism in physics. By the way, these 3 points, you're not going to see them repeated in literally every single domain that we're about to cover, but there's like 4 or 5, maybe 6 points max that are constantly repeated that you're going to see. So the supersession of dualism, you're going to see that in pretty much every other, in pretty much every single domain we're about to cover. Same thing with the time problem, and then a tendency towards the irrationality. Those are the most common. So we can see it, obviously. The rationalist, space against time. These two negate each other. They're separate. They must be reconciled. Einstein and Gebser say, no, there is no space and time. Space, time, boom. Why is it space-time? Because time is that invisible dimensional backdrop that allows space to manifest and to unfold. And in that unfolding confers a certain degree of order and significance to it. Once it is, that is to say, the temporal sequencing of the spatial object is also integrated and also used to sort of make sense, if you will, if in an irrational meaning. His verification that energy and mass/matter were not opposites but, as we have described above, merely differing manifestational forms of one and the same thing, points in the same direction. There you go. The most pointed statement of this new knowledge comes from Eddington, who calls, quote, mass only another name for energy. So in physics, energy and mass, it's like saying, I don't know. You're just repeating yourself. I was trying to think of something. I couldn't. Maybe if I put the snood on. Thereby emphasizing the aspect of physical energy. The consistent application of such discoveries in quantum theory as the uncertainty principle has led to such objective and not merely philosophical conclusions as that of Arthur March, who observed that, quote, the world is inseparable from the observing subject and is accordingly not objectifiable. So, object, subject, completely gone. Why? Because the dualism has been superseded in the form that, remember, kind of quantum logic, and remember my Kill Rationalism video about transcending rationality with quantum logic and quantum mechanics. Consciousness itself plays the decisive role in our case, would be even just asserting the ontological validity of a particular object. So this object-subject dualism, that's gone. The subject sort of creates and conditions the object, and the object wouldn't really be understandable without the subject. Oh, also, the world is inseparable from the observing subject and is accordingly not objectifiable. Who does that sound like on a philosophical, cultural level? Sounds like the postmodernist to me. Sounds like you're appealing to perspectivity. What you're going to see is, well, I've already made a video about this, connections between the postmodern philosophy and the incipient manifestations or themes or aspects of the 4D structure, which in this case would be an appeal to position. The world is not object, so we're appealing to the subject's position, right? Same thing with postmodernism. Please go watch my video about that. I think it's called What the Hell is Postmodernism? It might be Seeing the World Antiquely number 2 or 3. Thus, even the old antinomies of world versus man, object versus subject, became, like mental perspectivity, untenable from the standpoint of physics. It also becomes additionally untenable insofar as recognizing that the uncertainty principle, which, as he just claimed, I mean, assuming it's taken literally, I don't know if you can posit things as just, this is what this is what that is, just is what it is. So the dualism, it's gone. Further developments in quantum theory, such as those in wave mechanics, have verified that light, and therefore matter itself, invariably occurs both as corpuscle and as a wave. The rational inconsistency of this basic fact of physics was not explained in terms of, say, a principle of duality, but rather by the establishment of the complementary principle by Niels Bohr. We already kind of talked about this. What implication can be drawn from these data? We can infer in any event that the strictly rational scheme of thought can be described as no longer adequate. It is true that it still provides makeshift solutions, but its universal validity has been shaken. The great dualistic concepts which provided its tension and excitement have become tenuous. So not only in the form of unifying space and time, or better yet, integrating space and time, not only in the form of recognizing the uncertainty principle, which completely, it at the very least precludes the possibility of being so sure that what you posit in that triangular mode of thought that rationality does is set and static, and that's what it is, not really. And then, of course, with space-time, you only appeal really to the subject's position. And in that case, it's not really objectifiable. It's only objective from one particular position, and then in that case, it doesn't become objective at all. The formal attempts to rescue the rational scheme are evident in such instances as the development of a three-valued logic, which received its systematic form at the hands of H. Reichenbach, an attempt, however, that may well be inconclusive because it does not go beyond mere systemization. This will be borne out by the publication of C.F. von Weizsäcker's quantum logic, of which more will be said later. Inasmuch as we do not need to concern ourselves for the moment with philosophical attempts, we will get there. Yeah, again, I can't stress this. If you want me to hear me like break this down and directly connect quantum mechanics to quantum logic, please go watch that video in my Kill Rationalism series. What is of interest here is the dualistic thinking with its three-dimensional structure is for the most part no longer adequate for the new knowledge and discoveries in physics. Anyone who is compelled to recognize the irrelevance of the dualisms can no longer employ a form of realization based on the concept of oppositions represented by thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Here, the new physics, quote-unquote, oversteps the bounds of the mental structure and is moving toward a mode of realization which, though not yet consciously, has begun to take shape in a four-dimensional and integral form. Let's see. The second set of indications of aperspectivity can be augmented by further data which evidence the same tendency and have the identical close relationship to the problem of the supersession of dualism just dealt with, as this has to the, quote, discovery of time discussed earlier. The third and last datum to be adduced here has to do with the visibility or conceivability of the new, quote, image of the world, unquote, in physics that cannot be visualized. This brings us to our third point, which is the non-visualizable nature of the 4D discoveries. Obviously, as we've covered extensively on this channel, rationality is limited to perspectivity, which is visual sight. If we are transcending this seems to necessitate that we're not going to go beyond what is visible. And grasp in some irrational way the invisible. So I don't care if rationalists are unable to do this. That's your problem. You remind them that their thoughts, that their psyche, and all this stuff, all their internal state, are immaterial, that they derive from material origins is irrelevant. The coat hanger, if the coat hanger falls, the coat falls with it. That doesn't mean the coat hanger becomes the coat. Just because the immaterial has material origins doesn't mean they become the same thing. It's silly. The non-visualizable nature of the present-day world quote-unquote image of physics is a fact which is repeatedly emphasized in physical research. All attempts to render the atomic structures and events in visual or graphic form and to force them into the realm of conceptuality, that is, the mental form of realization, may be considered today as failures. Repeat for emphasis. All attempts to render the atomic structures and events in visual or graphic form and to force them into the realm of conceptuality, that is, the mental form of realization, may be considered today as failures. So every time you try to rationally understand through 3D mode of thought, the 4D discoveries and manifestations, you will fail. One such attempt among many was the Rutherford-Bohr model of the atom, which was intended to show in visual form the process in the atom. But as Arthur March has observed, quote, it had to be abandoned by quantum mechanics and be replaced by a totally non-visualizable and purely mathematical construct, since its visible graphic form could not be reconciled with the fundamental law of nature, the principle of indeterminacy, unquote, and presented the actual processes not only in less precise but also falsified form. As Heisenberg has remarked, quote, these atomic laws can be only imprecisely transposed into visual images of the atom. For Planck's quantum hypothesis, on which these laws are based, contains on principle a non-visualizable element. Beautiful. Also, time is invisible. Time is real. There you go. As a consequence of quantum theory, physics was also compelled to abandon its venerable principle of causality. I think I'll explain more in the psychology section. That's going to be interesting. On the basis of the universal quantum of action discovered by Planck, we now know that the basic course of events is acausal, discontinuous, and indeterminate. Very important. We know this, and we've heard scientists speak about this. We've heard biologists, present-day biologists, saying, no, there is no goal to particular organism. There is none. It's not as simple as this basic causality thing. What you see is acausality. In biology, organisms make acausal leaps. It doesn't happen in this sort of progressive, chronological, step-by-step causal. It can, but not always. Obviously, we're transcending 3D causality and all that stuff. Both the constancy and the sequential consistency, which represent the basic laws of conceptual thought, have become to a considerable degree illusory, at least in physics. And he says, both the constancy and the sequential consistency, remember what I talk about with the one after the other, the chronological, this is what helps rational thought operate. That is being destroyed. Now it's acausal, it's sudden, it's discontinuous. Quote, today physics is no longer in a position to defend a strict determinism. It must of necessity reduce the earlier certainty of its predictions to a mere probability. That's another thing. You always hear scientists say, I can't promise you, but it's very likely. It is compelled to do so because the processes of nature do not cohere continuously as was previously believed, but are interrupted by discontinuities, through which we cannot trace the causality, unquote. These words of Arthur March are further accentuated with respect to the equivocal nature of conceptual thought by the further observations that present-day physics, for example, must concede that, quote, our intellect, which is rationality, is inadequate to understand nature, and consequently we are unable to reproduce its mechanisms by means of a conceptual construct. The inadequacies of our intellect prevent us from capturing reality in our conceptual world. I mean, what more clear denunciation of concept do you need? And concept obviously belongs to the 3D world. The mode of realization of the mental consciousness structure with its spatial confines is no longer sufficient to comprehend, quote-unquote, reality. That's Gebser. Only a new structure can achieve this. And how could nature be grasped by three-dimensional thought since its quote-unquote building blocks, the phenomena of the atomic nucleus, are, as C.F. von Weizsäcker has specifically noted, beyond spatial dimensions? It is this quote-unquote dematerialization, which we might also define as delimitation, accompanied by removal of temporal limits, inasmuch as the quantum of action has no temporal limitation, which gives present-day physics its non-visualizable stamp. Again, in the words of Arthur March. So they're simply put, they seem to be recognizing the immaterial. They seem to be saying, okay, there's clearly immaterial process. We're dematerializing things insofar as we are admitting the immaterial. That apparently, in science, can be understood mathematically. I can tell you what 86 times 17 is. It's 1,462. I don't think I'd be able to do this. To quote Arthur March, I've quoted this before in other videos. This is the standpoint arrived at by physics today. The objective essence of things consists of a structure and not something of substance. A structure is an invisible pattern, in this case, is an invisible pattern of interdependency or interrelationships. So that is what is really constituting the world, not spatial objects of spatial substance, which is fascinating to think about. I'm going to repeat for emphasis. The objective essence of things consists of a structure and not something of substance. Let us take, for example, the electron. Its appearance is that of something real, a substantial particle which belongs to the real and objective world and is not something conjured up by our imagination. Pretty makes sense to me, right? It's something out here. It's not just fully made up. But let us not be deceived by this appearance. If we analyze in depth the experiences on which our faith in the existence of a substantive electron rests, nothing remains except a system of constant relationships, pattern of interrelationships, which is termed a structure in mathematics, so that we are required to accept these relationships and not the substantive particle as the true reality. And to the extent to which our doubts about the objective existence of a substantive electron are correct is proven by our experience with particles which shed their physical properties and behave not like a corpuscle, but like a wave. Now, if you're thinking about this difference between structure versus object of substance, think about rationality. Rationality is not just this one thing, right? It belongs to this preceding structure, patterns of interdependence. So in rationality's case, it would be direction, discursive thought, triangular patterns and pyramidal thought, space, obviously, perspectivity. There are all these patterns of interrelationships, right? All these patterns of interdependence. So even something as simple as rationality is not just this simple, oh, that's what it is, just logic. Yes and no. Think about the invisible structures that are creating conditioning logic and allowing it to operate effectively. This is great what Gebser says here. It should be obvious that this perception of the world not only achieves a delimitation, thus tacitly admitting its escape from mental reflection and representation, but also establishes time freedom and thus withdraws from the psychic realm. Moreover, it achieves a desubstantivation and thus even a grasp of vital magic components. These remarks require no further comment. They speak most distinctly for themselves, which is true, honestly. I mean, the great thing about some of these guys, like this Arthur March dude, he writes very clearly. You can tell when people understand are confident in what they're saying. They write very clearly. Gebser writes very clearly. I mean, I couldn't write that better myself. It's beautiful. In physical terms, the aperspectivity of this world perception can still be structured mathematically, and it is symptomatic that a physicist chances upon the keywords transparent clarity, toward which aperspectivity tends as its realization form in place of the previous forms of representation and conceptualization. So all the rational stuff that's being superseded by rendering transparent. Transparent clarity is the mode of realization for 4D structure stuff. This is not to imply that aperspectivity is bound to mathematics. Only in the area of physical research is it bound to numbers. But since a persistent rejection of the previous forms of realization has come about precisely in this area, it is undoubtedly an indication of the breakthrough into a new consciousness structure. The results of the new research in physics adduced here are thus, in this sense, at the very least, inceptions and initial manifestations of an aperspectival kind. Heisenberg once spoke of the mistaken, quote, generalization of the rational, classical and mechanical, natural sciences, making them into a rationalistic world view, unquote. Adding that, quote, just as any generalization is immediately fruitful in opening new avenues of thought in many areas, so shall we today best serve the future by paving the way for the newly acquired forms of thought rather than by opposing them simply because they appear to be extremely difficult. Perhaps it is not too audacious to hope that the new spiritual energies will bring us closer to the unity of a scientific worldview which has been so endangered in recent years. Unquote. These words contain an unspoken warning that the mathematized natural sciences in turn should not lead to an exclusively mathematical world view. And the expressed hope for the new spiritual energies is definitely aimed at the new consciousness mutation in our sense, which Hofland already intimated when he spoke of the necessity of the new strength of spirit. It will be necessary for us to give an account of the potential time freedom, for it is in this space-time freedom that the decisive atomic processes occur. If we do not, we will again falsify the world by reducing it to an expanded quantifiable framework, or become resigned to the inadequacy of such a framework. So, space-time freedom, time freedom, really. That's the key to transcending 3D rational stuff. The ability to recognize the different layers of time that we move through, recognize its purpose as an invisible dimensional backdrop, and to employ different modes of time based on different spatial circumstances. And of course, if you're time-free and it's space-time, you become space-free too. As evidenced by the electron no longer existing as a particle of substance, but just part of a transparent, clear structure. It's a series of interrelationships. All right. The fact that physics, by its discoveries, was forced to supersede the previously valid three-dimensional structure and concern itself with new forms of realization is as significant as the fact that these discoveries could have been made at all. The final discovery is invariably a realization of a predisposition, in this case of a predisposition toward a more intensive consciousness structure. Beautiful. The predisposition is evident from a statement by Leopold Infeld, quote, the entirety of all possible events constitutes a four-dimensional world, unquote. The remark indicates that we cannot represent the four-dimensional world since the, quote, entirety of all possible events, unquote, can neither be realized by our understanding nor grasped rationally, which is true. Of course, we all know the dividing characteristics of rationality. It simply must do that to operate. And of course, if you're take the perspective I'm looking around, I'm looking at my camera, I'm looking at you guys, I can see some things to my right, see some things to my left. Well, if you just kind of move me up and give me the bird's eye view, that's a different perspective. I can't do that. I can't be two places at once in a physical sense, so rationally it's not going to work. Let's see. And apart from the non-visualizability identified here, Infeld's statement contains an additional significant indication, since possibility is a potency or a latent intensity, and therefore a quality. Four-dimensionality, therefore, also has a qualitative character in contrast to the spatial emphasis. Measurability and basically quantitative aspects of three-dimensionality. It obviously makes sense that the 4D structure and transcending mere quantity would also integrate that quantity with quality. So you will see, and we'll talk more about it when it comes to probably the sociological section. That'll be interesting. We're going to talk about time as a quality, and I think it's important. But I've also made videos about this. It is noteworthy that this qualitative aspect was implicitly underscored by the physicist and co-worker of Einstein, and we might add that the non-visualizability of the four-dimensional structure, which has four-dimensionality as an expression of the integrum, is always concerned with the whole, and is qualitative in nature, definitely has an irrational stamp. Finally, we would mention that the ultimate consequence of the nature of the electron, one of the elementary particles which are the building blocks of our world and of the universe, indicate that it is without substance, Fascinating. That means that it is a transparent structure. Arthur March has illuminated the non-substantiality and structural character of the electron, drawing the consequences of W. Pauli's, quote, exclusion principle, unquote. This desubstantialization ultimately changes the non-visual nature of even the, quote-unquote, material realm into transparency or diaphaneity. Fascinating. So, in moving, or in perceiving what was perceived as material on Thursday as part of a transparent, immaterial, clear structure on Friday, in a way, how does he phrase it? You've changed even the material realm into transparency, even though we can see that it's not, in a sense. So it's both transparent and not transparent simultaneously. Paradox, baby. In April of 1958, Werner Heisenberg announced his world formula. It is based on nonlinear differential equations which exclude the principle of superpositions of fields. The punctual, quantitative, summation is renounced in favor of qualitative involution. The product replaces the sum. The elementary particles lose their point-like character, which we have given them by our previous habits of thought, and can now be seen as structures. Also, interesting that he says point-like character, because of course, point-like character, that is a part of rationality, obviously. It's obviously a part of the magical structure, too. This has been a decisive step towards de-rigidifying thought. In April 1964, George B. Shivajanovich and E. Janet in Switzerland successfully demonstrated, using K-plus mesons in their experiments, that elementary particles of decreasing size below a certain point are not punctual, which is quantitative, but are in fact structures. Their demonstration, described as the Bakunin effect, has unavoidably forced us to alter our understanding of reality from the predominantly conceptual nature of our thinking habits with their punctuate character in favor of the mode of realization of the new irrational consciousness which we have endeavored to make evident on these pages. All right. That'll be where we stop today. Thank you guys for your patience. I will see you guys soon. And get yourself a snud, all right? You haven't gone with a girl in a while? If I walked by your house and your wife saw me, don't lie. She'd be like, okay. Who's that ninja over there? That's cool. I love you guys. I'll see you guys next week. We're starting on biology, and we'll get into things like chronogeneity and Goethe and all this cool stuff. So I love you guys. You guys are the best. I'll see you soon.